The drive to the campsite was long, the car humming steadily along the winding roads that led deeper into the forests of New Mexico. The landscape had a serene quality to it, a place untouched, where the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional distant call of a bird. Denise and I had been planning this trip for months. We both needed a break, something away from the chaos of our everyday lives. We arrived in the late morning, setting up our tents in a quiet corner of the campgrounds, away from the main area. There was something comforting about the silence of the forest, about being so far removed from everything. We unpacked our gear and set to work making the campsite our own. Denise pulling out her old, reliable stove while I worked on getting the fire started. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled my senses, but a slight unease lingered in the back of my mind. I pushed it away. It was probably just the unfamiliarity of the place. Over the next few days, we hiked through trails we had picked out in advance, each one seeming more picturesque than the last. The further we went, the deeper into the woods we found ourselves. The trees grew taller, the underbrush thicker, and the sounds of the world faded until all that remained was the wind through the branches and the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the forest floor. By the third day, I had begun to feel a strange tension in the air. A heaviness that hadn't been there before. The forest was still beautiful, yes, but something about it had changed. The trails seemed longer, the shadows deeper. Denise didn't notice, but I felt it, a presence lurking just beyond the edges of the woods. At night, it was the silence that got to me. There was no wind, no animals calling, just a deep, suffocating quiet. I kept checking the perimeter of the campsite, but I never saw anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, I woke up to a sound outside the tent. A branch snapping, loud, deliberate. I stiffened, trying to make sense of it, but all I could hear was the deafening silence that followed. I glanced at Denise, whose rhythmic breathing told me she was deep in sleep. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sign of movement. There it was again, a soft rustling. Something was out there. I slid out of the sleeping bag slowly, careful not to wake Denise, and unzipped the tent just a crack, peering out into the inky blackness. The fire had long since died, leaving the campsite in a shroud of shadows. But I couldn't see anything. No animals, no rustling leaves. Just the dark woods pressing in from all sides. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, something harmless. But my gut told me otherwise. The sound of those branches snapping, it was too precise, too purposeful. I lay there, wide awake for the rest of the night, eyes fixed on the dark outside the tent, listening to every small sound. Eventually, I drifted off, but it was restless sleep, filled with dreams of eyes watching me from the trees. The next morning, Denise and I set off for a longer hike, hoping to get a bit more distance between us and the campsite. We followed a narrow path deeper into the forest, the air now thick with fog that rolled in from the mountains. The atmosphere was heavier than usual, and I noticed that the birds, which had been singing the day before, were now eerily silent. We stopped for a break on a rise, where we could look out over the dense trees that stretched for miles. As I stood, stretching my legs, I spotted something in the dirt near a cluster of rocks, a set of footprints. They weren't human, I could tell that much immediately. But they weren't from any animal I recognized either. The prints were large, longer, too big for a wolf and not quite the right shape for a bear. They almost seemed wrong. Like someone had tried to walk like an animal, but couldn't hit it quite right. I crouched down, tracing the edges with my fingers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Denise came over and glanced at them. "Weird," she said, not looking too concerned. "Probably just some odd animal." I nodded, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something about them that didn't sit right with me. Still, I didn't press it. I let it go, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. As night fell, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air any longer. The campsite felt different. The fire burned low, flickering in the cold wind that had started to pick up, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the clearing. I kept glancing around, feeling eyes on the back of my neck, my heart thumping in my chest. "Val, you're acting weird again," Denise said from across the fire. She looked at me over the rim of her mug, her brow furrowed. I don't know, something's off, I muttered, staring into the fire. But even the fire didn't make me feel better tonight. Then it came, low, guttural, and unmistakable. Wow. Not a bear, not a wolf. This sound was deeper, more menacing. I froze, looking into the woods. The growl didn't come again. But my instincts told me it was still out there, watching. Denise didn't hear it at first. I almost hoped she didn't, but when she finally caught my eyes, she knew something was wrong. What was that? She asked, voice tense. "I don't know," I said, swallowing hard. Maybe we should pack up and leave." Denise rolled her eyes, as if trying to calm me down. "You're being paranoid. It's probably just a mountain lion or something." But I knew better. The growl hadn't been an animal. I couldn't explain it, but something inside me screamed that we were not alone. We stayed up longer that night, talking in hushed voices and keeping the fire blazing, but the growl stayed with me. It was in my head, echoing in the silence. Around midnight, I heard it again, a movement in the woods, like something large, walking on two legs. A thud followed by the crunch of branches. The noise came closer, too close. I grabbed Denise's arm. "We need to go. Now." She looked at me, then at the dark woods, her face pale. I don't think we can just leave." "What if it's..." But before she could finish, the growl came again, louder, unmistakably close. And then, the voice, it was soft at first. A whisper. "Help me," Denise froze, her eyes wide with terror. That's not possible." And then it happened. The thing emerged from the trees. A figure. At first, it looked like a man, tall, hunched, with ragged clothes, but then I saw its eyes. Too wide. Too bright. Its face was stretched, contorted, skin drawn too tight over its bones. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed Denise's hand and we ran. The woods weren't the peaceful haven we had come to love. Now they were a maze, a labyrinth of trees and shadows closing in on us as we sprinted, our feet slapping the wet earth. My heart raced, and each step felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling us back. Behind us, the sound of movement followed. The creature, whatever it was fast. Too fast. We couldn't outrun it, I realized. Every time I looked back, I saw only darkness, and then the snap of twigs, closer and closer. The chase had begun, our legs burned with each step, but we couldn't stop. The woods closed in around us like a living thing, the trees bending and shifting as though they were part of the nightmare chasing us. I could hear it, heavy, uneven footsteps behind us. It wasn't running like we were, it was walking, pacing, like it was toying with us. Denise was breathing hard, struggling to keep up. I glanced over at her, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her normally strong, steady demeanor was gone, replaced by a wild look in her eyes, the same one that something to give us an advantage. It didn't give us the luxury of thinking. Every time we slowed down to catch our breath, the growl echoed from the darkness, sending us back into motion. It was a sound that vibrated in my chest, like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. I glanced around. The trees had become a blur, their shadows too dark, too oppressive. The path ahead was lost to us, there were no trails left, no sign of where we were going. It felt like we were being pulled deeper into a labyrinth. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of something running, fast and heavy. A rustle, a blur of movement behind us, and then a sickening crack. A branch snapped right above my head. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't see anything, just darkness. It was there. I could feel it, Denise, we need to, I started, but she was already pulling ahead, the panic overtaking her. She had seen something. She had seen it before I did. I followed her as best I could, dodging branches and rocks, until finally, we broke through the underbrush and found a small clearing. I was gasping for air, my legs weak, and I nearly collapsed to my knees, but Denise stopped suddenly, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Val, look. She whispered, her voice shaking. I looked up and saw what had caught her attention. Up ahead in the clearing, standing just beyond the trees, was a figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. The skinwalker, or whatever it was silent now, its eyes glistening in the darkness. I froze. The air felt thick, and the creature's eyes seemed to pierce through the dark. It wasn't human. No human could have eyes like that, too wide, too empty. We can't outrun it, I whispered, my throat dry. Denise shook her head, clearly panicked. We have to try. Before I could respond, the creature made its move. It was a blur of motion, its limbs moving at an unnatural angle, its body twisting as if the bones inside it had a life of their own. It didn't run, it crawled, moving on all fours, and then back onto two legs in a way that made my stomach churn. We turned to run, but the clearing was too open. No trees to hide behind, no shelter. The creature was faster now, more aggressive. I could hear it gaining on us, the sound of its claws scraping against bark, its breath shallow and ragged, like it was feeding off our fear. We pushed ourselves harder, our lungs burning, but it was getting closer. The growling roared again, louder than before, and I knew it was time to do something. Anything. I didn't even think. I grabbed a large branch from the ground and swung it back as I turned to face the creature. It was the only weapon I had, desperate. The stick collided with something solid, its arm, its chest, but the creature didn't flinch. It didn't stop. It just kept coming, eyes fixed on me, and then it did something I hadn't expected. It spoke. But it wasn't human speech. Run. It hissed, its voice gravelly and broken. Or die. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to get out of there. But I felt rooted to the ground. Its voice. It was like it was in my head, speaking directly to me. Run. I snapped, trying to pull Denise forward, but she was frozen in fear, staring at the creature. We ran again, no longer thinking, no longer questioning. Every step felt like an eternity as the creature continued to follow, its footsteps echoing in our ears. There was no end in sight. We were trapped. By the time we stumbled into what seemed like another clearing, the first rays of morning light were starting to break through the trees. But it was far too late. We were both exhausted, our muscles trembling from the hours of running, and the creature. It had not let up, I could barely even think straight. The branches of the trees around us seemed to close in tighter, casting even darker shadows across the ground. Every direction seemed to lead us further into the unknown. Val, Denise gasped, her voice breaking. What do we do now? I didn't have an answer. I wanted to tell her we could make it back to the campsite, that we could find safety, but the truth was, I didn't know where we were anymore. The woods had become a maze. Every tree, every rock seemed unfamiliar, like the forest itself had shifted in the dark while we ran. I could hear it again, closer, moving silently through the trees, stalking us. I scanned the clearing, desperate for a plan. Anything. The sun had barely risen, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor, but it didn't feel like we were any closer to escape. My mind raced for an answer, for a way out, but there was nothing, and then, in the distance, I saw something that gave me a flicker of hope, a silhouette moving, another figure. At first, I thought I was imagining things, my mind playing tricks on me. But no, this figure was real. It was moving toward us with purpose, and I could see it clearly now, a hiker, someone out here in the woods. Help! I shouted, waving my arms frantically, but the figure didn't respond. It just kept walking, its pace slow and deliberate. And And as it came closer, I realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't another person. But it wasn't a human face, it was one of the skinwalkers. Another one. The figure moved toward us, its steps slow and deliberate, its eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. Pushing ourselves to the edge of exhaustion, but every path we took led us further into the heart of the forest. The trees, the shadows, they were closing in. There was no way back, and then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the skinwalkers seemed to vanish. The noises stopped. The growling, the heavy footsteps, all of it went silent. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. My chest heaved with the effort to breathe, and I stumbled, nearly collapsing to the ground. Denise grabbed my arm to steady me. "Where did they go?" she gasped, her voice ragged. I didn't answer. I was too scared to. My mind was spinning with confusion. We couldn't be this lucky. It didn't make sense. Suddenly, a sharp screech pierced the silence, a high-pitched, bone-chilling scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It echoed through the trees, rattling the air. The skinwalkers hadn't left. They had only been waiting, watching, preparing. Without warning, the forest erupted with movement. From all sides, they came, crawling, running, twisting through the trees with terrifying speed. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I felt the overwhelming urge to collapse, but we didn't have the luxury of collapsing. Not now. I grabbed Denise's hand and dragged her forward, pushing through the branches whipping against my face. Behind us, the skinwalkers were moving again, faster this time. We weren't going to outrun them, we have to fight back, I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. Denise looked around, panting, and then, just as desperation began to set in, I spotted something, a large rock, jutting out of the ground at the edge of the clearing. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, and with a strength I didn't know I had, I swung it at the first skinwalker that leapt toward us. It connected with a sickening crack, and the creature staggered back, momentarily stunned. But it didn't fall. It growled, that same guttural sound, and came at us again. I screamed. Denise and I ran in the opposite direction, back into the maze of trees, but this time, we weren't just running blindly. We were looking for any sign of a way out. A path. A road. Anything, but the forest was endless. The trees stretched on forever, and with every turn, the skinwalkers closed in on us more. There was no escape. There was no safety. We were being herded, I realized. They weren't hunting us like animals. They were playing with us. The sun was starting to set again, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. The forest seemed to be alive now, moving with a purpose. And I felt it in my bones, a primal, overwhelming fear. The skinwalkers weren't just creatures of the forest. They were part of it. They knew it better than we ever could. We weren't just running from them. We were running from the forest itself. The next few hours blurred together. The fear, the running, the endless cycle of exhaustion and panic, it all became one overwhelming force that threatened to break me. I had never felt so utterly helpless. We stopped at some point, or maybe we collapsed. I can't really remember. All I know is that we were both trembling, lying on the cold, wet ground beneath a dense thicket of pine trees. The night had fully fallen, and the forest around us felt darker, more oppressive. The noises had stopped. But I knew the creatures were out there, waiting. I don't know how long we lay there, huddled together, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. Every small sound made us flinch. Every rustle of leaves was a threat. But eventually, I gathered enough strength to sit up, to force myself to face the reality of our situation. There was no way out. Not unless we fought, and that's when I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. A flicker of light, so small at first, but then it grew. A campfire. Another campsite. A survivor. I nudged Denise. Look. We need to get there. She didn't respond at first, too exhausted to process what I was saying. But when I stood and started moving, she followed, the instinct to survive pushing her forward that we had no choice but to take the risk. The forest around us seemed to stretch longer with each step. The glow from the fire grew brighter, but as we neared, something felt off. The closer we got, the more I could hear. It was a low chant, a whisper, like voices carried on the wind. And then I saw it. The fire wasn't just a campfire. It was a circle, a ritualistic circle, and standing in it were figures cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden. One of them stepped forward. "Run, or join the circle," the figure said. Its voice a low rasp. I knew then that the skinwalkers weren't our only threat. The figure's voice was like ice running through my veins. We froze in place, our feet unwilling to move. The chanting behind us continued, low and rhythmic, growing louder as if the forest itself was participating in this twisted ritual. The circle of cloaked figures stood motionless, their faces hidden in shadow, their movements synchronized with the whispering winds. "Run, or join the circle." The voice was deeper now, more menacing. A guttural command that made my heart pound in my chest. For a moment, I thought we were hallucinating. It was possible, right? The fear, the exhaustion, the terror, it was all around my mind. But the fire's flickering light illuminated the figures clearly enough. The air around us felt heavy, charged with something ancient, something wrong. I turned to Denise, my voice trembled. "What do we do?" She looked at me, eyes bright with terror. There was a strange feeling of understanding. Her face alive. She spoke in a hushed whisper. "They're part of it. The skinwalkers, they're just the beginning. These people, they worship them." The realization hit like a slap across my face. This wasn't just a random encounter. This wasn't a simple creature stalking us through the woods. This was something far worse. We had stumbled into a place where ancient rituals were alive, something dark, primal, and unrelenting. I looked back at the cloaked figures, then to the dark woods behind us. We were surrounded. We could hear the skinwalkers, no longer chasing us, but circling, their guttural growls blending with the low chant, their eyes glowing from the shadows of the trees. They were part of this ritual, part of the hunt, the sacrifice. "What if we don't run?" Denise whispered, her voice breaking. "Then we die," I said, with a sinking feeling in my stomach. The figure in the circle stepped forward again, its face still hidden by a hood, but its presence, its power, was undeniable. It was the leader. It was the one calling the shots. The fire flickered and flared around it as it lifted one arm slowly. Suddenly, the chant stopped, the forest went quiet. Then, a voice came from the figure. "You are lost, and now you belong to us." My blood ran cold. There was something in that voice. Something familiar. It wasn't just a man, or even a creature, it was something older. Something that had lived in the forest long before humans walked on this land. Before I could react, the figure raised its arms higher. The chanting resumed, louder this time, reverberating through my bones, filling my head with an unbearable pressure. The trees seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The air thickened. The skinwalkers, they weren't just creatures of flesh and bone. They were part of this ritual, this hunt. The figures in the circle weren't human either. They were twisted, wearing the skin of something long lost. And their eyes, they were alive with the same hunger that we'd seen in the creatures chasing us. The circle had formed. We were the prey. We have to fight back, I said, my voice cracking as I reached for the nearest object. A jagged rock at my feet. But before I could lift it, one of the cloaked figures stepped forward, its presence suffocating. "You are too late," the figure said, its voice sharp and commanding. "The forest has claimed you. You are now part of the hunt. You will join the circle, whether you want to or not." Denise and I backed away slowly, but the skinwalkers had moved closer. The air had become thick with their presence. There was nowhere to go. Then, the ground shook, a deafening roar split the air, and something massive emerged from the shadows of the trees. At first, I thought it was just a larger skinwalker, more monstrous, more twisted than the others. But as it came into view, I saw the truth. It was not a skinwalker. It was something far worse, a towering figure, standing at least 10 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur, its body bent and twisted like a monstrous tree. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a horrifying mask of stitched-together flesh, hollow eyes glowing with a malignant hunger. It wasn't just part of the hunt. It was the leader of the skinwalkers, the one who controlled them. The chant reached a fever pitch as the skinwalkers howled in response to their master's presence. The giant creature's eyes locked onto us, its smile wide, too wide. I could feel its gaze pierce through me, through my very soul, as if it was savoring the moment before our deaths. "Run," I whispered hoarsely, but my legs were frozen. Denise didn't move either. The terror had consumed us both, and then, with a burst of adrenaline, Denise snapped out of her trance and grabbed my arm. "We run. Now." I didn't need any more encouragement. We turned and fled into the darkness, not daring to look back. The giant's roar echoed behind us, reverberating through the trees like thunder. The skinwalkers followed in a frenzy, their growls and screeches echoing all around us. We ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, our legs aching, our breaths ragged. The forest seemed endless. No matter how fast we ran, the creatures were always just behind us. The chanting and growling mixed with the sound of our panicked footsteps, a cacophony of terror that was driving me insane, and then I saw it, the distant glow of firelight. A cabin. A small house, barely visible through the trees, over there. I gasped. We made a mad dash toward the cabin, praying it wasn't another trick, another part of the nightmare. The door was ajar, but when we reached it, I hesitated. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Inside the cabin, there was nothing. Empty walls. Old, rotting furniture. No one. No way out, but the skinwalkers were coming closer. We were cornered. There was no way out of this cabin. No exit. No escape. The door slammed shut behind us, and we could hear the skinwalkers outside, scratching, growling, and snarling. Their low growls sent chills through me. The cabin, decrepit and ancient, felt like it was closing in around us. The floor creaked under our weight, the air heavy with dust and fear. Denise and I backed into the far corner, our chests heaving with each desperate breath. I clutched the rusted iron rod, my knuckles white, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The creatures outside were faster. They were relentless. And that thing, that giant beast we'd seen, its twisted form, it was still out there, just waiting for us to make a mistake. For a moment, everything went silent. The creatures were outside, waiting. The chanting had stopped. The air was thick with anticipation, and then, in the oppressive silence, I heard something, a faint scraping sound, something moving just outside the door. "We have to do something," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "It will break through." Denise nodded, her face pale. "I know. We're not making it out if we stay here. We need to move." I looked around. The cabin wasn't big, and there were no weapons, nothing that could help us fight off the skinwalkers or that beast. My mind raced. I remembered something, a faint memory of the layout of the area when we'd first entered the woods. There was a creek nearby. It was risky, but if we could make it there, maybe, just maybe, we could hide long enough to get away. "We're not going to outrun them," I said, my voice steadying despite the chaos inside me. "But we can lose them in the creek. If we get in the water, they won't be able to track us." Denise's eyes were wide with desperation. "But the creek, it's miles away." I nodded. "It's our only shot." I grabbed her arm, pulling her to the door, but before I could even reach for the handle, a heavy thud echoed from the outside. The skinwalkers were right there, pounding on the walls. Their growls rising. We didn't have a choice. I threw open the door, and we dashed inside. The moment we stepped outside, everything felt worse. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could hear the creatures' growls growing louder, like they were closing in, but there was no time to think. The cabin's porch creaked under our feet as we ran down the steps, stumbling as we hit the ground. We didn't look back. I grabbed Denise's hand, pulling her along, my heart racing. The trees were lit, the ground uneven beneath our feet. My legs burned, but there was no stopping. We got to the creek, the skinwalkers' growls echoed behind us, their claws scraping against the ground, their footsteps heavy and unrelenting. But the sound of the creek, it was getting closer. I could hear the rushing water in the distance, and my heart picked up its pace. If we could just reach it, but then, I heard something worse. The low rumble of the giant skinwalker, the beast, getting closer, its roar filling the air like a thunderclap. I risked a glance behind me and saw its massive form breaking through the trees. Its eyes glowing red. It was faster than we were, its long strides eating up the distance between us with every step. We won't make it. Denise screamed, I gritted my teeth. We have to. We pushed ourselves harder, ignoring the pain in our legs, the exhaustion threatening to pull us down. The forest seemed endless, the shadows all blending together. But just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. The creek. The water, shimmering in the moonlight, rushing along the bank, we're almost there. I shouted, but the sound of the creature's roar came again, louder. Closer. I could feel its presence on my heels. It was too close. Without thinking, I pulled Denise toward the water. Both of us stumbling as we made our way down the muddy bank. The water was cold, shockingly so, but it felt like salvation. We waded into it, the current strong, tugging at our legs, the sound of the skinwalker's growls fading, muffled by the roar of the water. We stumbled further into the creek, the current growing stronger as we made our way deeper into the trees. The water reached our waists, but we kept moving, using the water to mask our scent. For a moment, it seemed like we had escaped. The howls of the skinwalkers became distant. We slowed down, our breaths ragged. Shivering not just from the cold but from the terror that still gripped us, we did it. Denise gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. But she wasn't convinced. Neither was I glanced around. The trees, the creek, it was all aglow. The forest still felt alive, still felt like it was watching us. The weight of what we had just escaped from hung heavy in the air, but we weren't out of danger yet, I could still hear them. The growls. The roars. The creatures weren't done. They knew the forest better than we did. We need to keep moving, I said, my voice low and firm. If they find our trail, we're dead. Denise nodded, too exhausted to argue. We moved further into the creek, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The water was our cover, but it wasn't enough to stop them. We weren't safe. Not yet, we kept walking. Hours passed. The forest grew darker, the trees thicker, and the sky above us started to lighten. But there was still no sign of civilization. Just endless woods, and the fear that, at any moment, the creatures would find us again. But then, as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, something changed. The forest, which had felt like a living, breathing nightmare, suddenly felt still. The creatures' growls had stopped, we weren't sure why, but we dared to stop and listen. It was almost like the forest had decided to let us go, for now. We didn't speak for a long time. We just stood there, soaked to the bone, shaking with cold and terror. But in that moment, we both realized something. We had made it through the night, we had escaped, for now.